Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about something that has been dubbed several different things. From Wonderplane to Frankenplane to Turkey to the worst military aircraft ever, what we're looking at today might be the strangest American plane from World War II that looked mostly like a normal plane. We'll be looking both at the story of the plane itself and whether or not it actually deserves the title of worst military aircraft ever. This is the Fisher XP-75 Eagle. Back in the early stages of World War II, American aircraft were not nearly as dominant as they would end up being. While such stalwarts as the P-38 and the P-51 did exist at this point, their era of superiority would be later on. At this point, one of the more mainstay, commonplace fighters was something like the P-40. Certainly no slouch and a solid plane overall, but a little bit outdated and outclassed when going up against the very best Japan and Germany had to offer. Because of the P-40's relative inferiority, in a vacuum anyway, the US Air Force wanted something better. Something that would outclass whatever enemy fighters it could come across, something with high max speed, a high rate of climb, and good operating range. Specifically, they wanted a plane that could reach upwards of 440 miles an hour, could climb at a rate of 5,600 feet per minute, and had a range of 2,500 miles. For late 1941, early 1942, what the Air Force was requesting was indeed a Wonderplane. To this request, the designer of the P-40, a man named Donovan Berlin, would submit an idea. Then working for General Motors, GM had been interested in manufacturing their very own aircraft. While they had been producing other designs contracted out to them, GM was looking to bring their own designs into the market, but with a twist. Instead of the more sluggish production that was typically associated with aircraft design and production at the time, in it generally being this handmade type affair with a lot of research and testing, GM wanted to bring some of the simplicity and savings that automotive assembly line production would offer. GM and Berlin would submit an idea that would be made largely out of parts already in production. Combine that with the most powerful engine they had available, GM was promising to push out these Wonderplanes quickly and cheaply. In promising such an outstanding plane, on October 10, 1942, GM, and more specifically Fisher Body, a division of GM, was awarded a contract for 2 prototype XP-75 aircraft to be delivered in 6 months' time. The original design concept would use components from 3 already in production aircraft. The wings would be pulled from the P-51. The tail and entire empennage would be pulled from the Dauntless dive bomber. The landing gear would be pulled from the F-4U Corsair. Oddly enough, the Corsair had inverted gull wings and shorter landing gear as a result. The P-51 wings were not inverted gull, so why GM decided to use inverted gull wing landing gear on a straight wing design, your guess is as good as mine. The resulting body design was a little bit odd-looking, dipping a little bit into the uncanny valley of aircraft design, I guess, but it was still workable nonetheless. Where the XP-75 would really stand out, both positively and negatively, was on the inside with its power plants and weaponry. GM would use the best engine they had available to them. Since GM also owned the Allison Engine Company, they would then use the best engine Allison had to offer, the V3420. Just as the XP-75 was a bit of a frankenplane, the V3420 was a bit of a Franken engine, in that it was actually just 2 Allison engines cobbled together into one single unit. the very commonplace and successful Allison V1710, as used in the P38, P39, P40, and P63, would be doubled up to run as a single unit, hence why the name of the new engine was the V3420. 1710 times 2 is 3420, very clever naming. But anyway, for use in the XP-75, and to drive a single propeller system, the engine would be located around the center of the fuselage behind the cockpit. The engine would have two separate drive shafts that extended under the cockpit and into a single gearbox that then spun a contra-rotating 6-blade propeller system. While the engine system was certainly powerful at 2,885 horsepower, the sheer weight and added complexity from the extra gear systems would certainly add a layer of difficulty and headache, especially for a plane designed to be built quickly and simply. Because of the engine's location, two air intakes were just slapped underneath the fuselage and looked kind of out of place. In addition to having one of the best engines available, the XP-75 would also be one of the most well-armed fighters in the U.S. arsenal. As was common for U.S. fighters and interceptors, there would be 6 50-caliber machine guns in the wings, 3 in each wing. In addition to that, though, would be another 4 50-caliber machine guns in the fuselage, towards the nose. These 4 guns would be calibrated to fire in between the blades of the counter-rotating propeller system, which, considering the 6 total blades contra-rotating, this would be incredibly difficult and annoying to accomplish. Again, an odd choice for an assembly line plane, but regardless, if it worked, then this plane could be amazing. However, even before the first model was completed, there were already some problems. First off, the initial production order was increased from 2 to 8, in an effort to get enough prototypes to help expedite flight testing and get the planes into combat. With this increase in requested prototypes, the U.S. military also issued a letter of intent for the order of 2,500 XP-75s, if the plane was successful in its testing. Regardless, the prototype order increase would likely delay the delivery of them since they had to make more of them. Further delaying the delivery of the first prototypes was a series of compounding design changes. I say compounding because, as it turns out, just slapping a plane together out of a mishmash of parts creates some issues. The P-51 wings would soon be swapped out with the wings of Don Berlin's very own P-40. The landing gear at some stage was swapped out to the P-47's landing gear, but that too was swapped out with the gear from the Dauntless. With these parts being swapped in and out, the design would have to be altered in small but still significant and time-consuming ways. This isn't like a gun rail where whatever you want can just be stuck on there with no real consequence. Every minute change can have an impact. Because of these changes made, the original 6-month delivery time was delayed quite a bit. Instead of being delivered around May 1943, the first prototype was finally delivered around November 1943 and would take to the air that same month. Its initial test results were incredibly disappointing. On the positive side, the plane was flying, so that's pretty nice. That's basically where the good ends for right now, though, as there were issues with the engine, the tail, and the wings. For one, the engine was not producing the power that was initially expected, nor was it adequately cooling down, resulting in it overheating quite frequently. There were also severe instability issues that gave the XP-75 a rather alarming tendency to spin and rotate uncontrollably. It was decided that both of these issues could be solved by altering the wings and tail section, but these fixes had consequences. For the wing fix, it was decided to extend the aileron flaps all the way out to the wing tips. While this may have partially solved the issue, it would also be a severe blow to the whole assembly line plane idea. The XP-75 now needed wings made exclusively for it. Additionally, because the ailerons were being extended, they had to install hydraulic boosters that would help the pilot keep them in control. With them being larger, the forces exerted on them would just be too much for the pilot to control on his own. This left just the tail and the landing gear as the only two parts taken from other designs. But in that effort to enhance the stability, the tail would have to be altered as well, enlarging the horizontal and vertical tail planes. This fix would also have a domino effect. Because the tail planes got bigger and thus heavier, it meant that the center of gravity had shifted too far to the rear of the plane. To fix this new issue, the nose of the plane was extended a few inches forward, giving the front a bit more weight. Even with all of these issues, there were more. Before some of these upgrades could be made, one of the prototype models was destroyed in a crash that led to the death of the test pilot. Certainly not a good look for the XP-75, but testing continued on regardless. With all of the prospective changes and improvements that had to be made, this would inevitably increase the weight and lower performance. After all of the improvements were made, the rate of climb, initially supposed to be over 5,000 feet per minute, was only around 3,000 feet per minute. Regardless though, testing and improvements continued into late 1944. The new and improved XP-75 looked a bit different than the original model, most notably having a new bubble-style canopy over the cockpit. The effective final design was also quite large, measuring in at 12.32 meters long, 15.04 meters wide, and 4.72 meters tall, weighing nearly 20,000 pounds gross. At its best, the XP-75 was reported to reach speeds upwards of 427 miles an hour. That number would be impressive for early on in the war, but for late 1944, that max speed didn't really stand out. Take the XP-72, for example, that first flew early in 1944 and had a max speed of 490 miles an hour, and even then that plane was not adopted. Still severely underperforming and still suffering from control and instability issues, the XP-75 project was finally cancelled on October 4th, 1944, with just 14 total aircraft produced. None of the produced models would have any of the armament installed either. Out of the original 14 made, just one of them still exists today, restored and currently residing at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, in all of its shiny tinfoil look and glory. At the end of the XP-75's career, the main factor that ended up being the death knell for it was a change in what was needed for the war effort. While back in 1942, a high-speed interceptor was needed to counter the Great Plains enemy countries were putting out, with Allied forces on the defensive, by late 1944, and even mid to late 1943, to be fair, the war situation had drastically shifted. In Europe, Germany was losing ground both on the eastern and western fronts, losing men, materiel, and viable aircraft in the process. The situation in Europe didn't call for interceptors and the like, it called for escorts for bombers. Similarly, in the Pacific, Japan was losing ground, not as severely as Germany was, but losing ground and clearly on the defensive. Again, what America needed here was now bomber escorts that could help take out Japanese defensive positions. Perhaps if the war were in a different place in either theater, then maybe testing on an aircraft like the XP-75 would have continued on, but it just wasn't, so it didn't. Fisher and GM did try to meet the changing needs in mid-1943, and they attempted to convert the existing XP-75s into long-range escort roles. But by that point, other aircraft were filling in for this role remarkably well. Planes like the P-51 and P-38 were doing just fine, so there was no real need to introduce a new aircraft in that role. Again, the planes they already had were standing up to enemy fighters just fine. They especially didn't need a new aircraft that was flying as poorly as the XP-75 was, and realistically, even if it was flying okay, it didn't offer much of an upgrade, if it even offered one at all. Thus, with no need for it to exist, the XP-75 would be dropped. Now onto the second part of the XP-75 story. The plane was a failure, a massive failure to be sure, but does it actually deserve the title of the worst military plane ever? As referenced on the YouTube channel Today I Found Out, for example, shout out to them. Again, it was certainly bad, but the worst ever, I'm not entirely sure. For one, and not to sound a bit snarky, but how can you actually decide what the worst military plane ever even is? I know that might sound a bit odd, but there are a lot of factors to take into account. How the plane performed, how many were made, how far it progressed, what the purpose of the plane was, all of these and more factor in. We know that the XP-75 performed quite poorly. We also know that just 14 of them were made, so it's not as if it had the actual chance to make any significant positive or negative impact. It also never got past testing, so again, same issue. Now, where I do think we can find a positive here is in the purpose of the plane. While the main purpose was to make a sort of wonderplane, an alternate purpose was an attempt or an experiment to try and bring more simple, easy, and cheap assembly line manufacturing to the world of aircraft production. Up to that point, plane assembly and testing was a rather sluggish affair. If aircraft could be pumped out en masse, I do think it may have been worth it, even if the planes ended up a bit inferior as a result. After all, sometimes, and especially in war, quantity is much better than quality. Now, aircraft manufacturing during the war did speed up quite significantly, don't get me wrong, but not to rates imagined by GM and the likes of Henry Ford, with his promise of 1,000 planes per day. Planes were being made in some places and in some companies, at best at around 1 an hour, or 24 in a full day, a far cry from 1,000. Where I think the real mistake of the XP-75 lies is in the management. Realistically, once it was realized that the tail and wings would have to be altered and thus specially made, thus ruining the assembly line idea, the XP-75 should have been cancelled then and there. They should have realized that this confirmed that the aircraft design couldn't really be done the same assembly line way. The real failure was continuing the project past the initial testing failure. So, while I don't personally think the XP-75 deserves the title of worst military plane ever, I do understand that perspective, but I would rather call it one of the most mismanaged planes of World War II. As for the worst plane ever, or the worst plane of World War II, I think there's a lot of debate and different directions that this could go. For a plane that never left the testing phase, I'd argue that the SAC AS-6 was worse, because that plane never actually managed flight in the first place. It could hop, but that was about it. I mean, if a plane can't fly, then it's really just a really big, weird-looking car. Staying in Germany, there was also the ME-163 that was adopted and used in combat, but was very underwhelming and actually killed a good number of test pilots in the process. It was basically more dangerous to the test pilots and its pilots than to enemy aircraft. Then there's something like the MXY-7, a kamikaze plane rocket thing that had hundreds of them produced to very little effect. They managed to take out a few small ships and a destroyer eventually, but it is very likely that the kamikaze nature of the plane led to the deaths of more Japanese pilots than Allied troops, a desperate, likely net negative project. These are just a few examples off the top of my head that I think could be in the running for worst plane of World War II. I don't really have a concrete answer to the question, but do let me know what you think down in the comments. Is the XP-75 the worst military plane ever, or the worst plane of World War II, or is there another aircraft you have in mind? And with that question, I think we'll go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Even though the plane looks weird, I do like the way the XP-75 looks. It's just kinda off and weird looking. Again, kinda uncanny valley for an aircraft. I do like the shiny silver look, though. Maybe they thought that making it really shiny would trick people into thinking that it was actually really good. But regardless, though, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.